Hello, everyone. Welcome back to No Talking Points, iPolitics signature podcast. I'm Marco Vigliotti, the host and editor-in-chief of iPolitics. I'm joined as always by my co-host, Brian Storseth, the publisher of iPolitics. And today we are joined by Bridget Howe of Crestview Strategy. Again, I sound like a broken record because every time we do the show, we always seem to have way too much to kind of ground to cover. And today obviously is no difference. We're going to start today talking about the big news over the weekend with, of course, the attacks in Iran led by the U.S. and Israel, which seems to have grown, or at least is threatening to grow into a wider regional war. We heard Mark Carney weigh in saying that this is something Canada supports, warns that Iran is the major destabilizing player in the region, and applauds the U.S. efforts to permanently put it to an end of their nuclear program. Some pushback we're seeing in some liberal circles saying, how does this line up with Mark Carney's Davos speech? Specifically his call not for Canada to align itself with the big hegemons, to kind of partner together with other middle powers to seek an alternative. I'll start with you, Bridget. What do you make of the Prime Minister's response to the U.S.-Israeli attacks?
Yeah, listen, I think the Prime Minister was fairly quick to come out with a statement, even amidst his international travel, very quick to specifically say that he supports the United States in their efforts to ensure that Iran does not possess a nuclear weapon. So I think the language there was very specific and chosen carefully. I think he also recognized that the goal here is for stability and for peace, and that Iran was posing a threat to those things. He also put out a statement this morning, I think it was earlier this morning, that he had spoken with the president of the UAE as well, and extended his supports, and again just sort of called for de-escalation in the Middle East, but with a very clear goal of supporting the U.S. in the prevention of Iran having access to a nuclear weapon. And so I think we will see, obviously, things are escalating and changing by the hour and by the minutes, and we'll have to see if that evolves. But it's just given where we are with our relationship between Canada and the United States, and on every other matter, it was interesting to see that he came out so quickly supporting the United States specifically on this one.
Yeah, I mean, Bridget makes a good point, Brian, that the PM's, almost immediate response to the start of the attacks, and the fact that it was so declarative, so certain that this is something that Canada is supportive of. Did that surprise you?
Well, it certainly surprised me, in as much as, Prime Minister Carney has got a lot of kudos and accolades for his Davos speech. In his Davos speech, he went to great lengths to talk about the shopkeeper that kept putting up the sign every day supporting the communist regime. At the end of the day, the first opportunity that Prime Minister Carney has, he's putting the sign up supporting what appears to be a massive breach of international law. And certainly the Iranian regime, by all accounts, was bad people, terrorist organization. Nobody's supporting that, but I think it's difficult to say since 1992 that they're months away from having nuclear weapons. And that's the reason why we needed to stop them when we just, invaded. The United States and Israel launched strikes only months ago saying that they had destroyed their capability to build nuclear weapons. So, I find this puzzling from Prime Minister Carney's perspective. I see the principled approach that the regime is not a good regime, but if it's a regime change war, then I also don't understand. And it's not just Prime Minister Carney. There are conservatives that are out there saying this as well. I can't recall the last time that a regime change war was successfully happened by air power only. So are they supporting troops on the ground in Iran? Like, there's a lot of unknowns here, and it really seems to be a little ham-fisted at this point in time. So I was surprised. It seems like an opportunity to come out and practice this middle power bit that the Prime Minister had talked about in his Davos speech. That doesn't seem to be the approach that we're taking here. And it does seem like over the last couple of days, the Foreign Minister has been backtracking on that a little bit, talking about the need for diplomatic relations. Minister McGuinty was out today saying that Canada and the military will not participate in this. So, I think they are trying to backtrack on it a little bit, but I thought it was a little aggressive, a little early on behalf of the Prime Minister.
Yeah, and Bridget makes a good point. To go to your point, Brian. It does seem like there's a bit of maybe not backpedaling, but the sense of like, okay, we put out that statement in support of what the US are doing, and now we're trying to, reach out to other partners in the region. And, I did notice that shift away from, or that shift towards calling for, diplomatic resolution to the conflict. It does seem a bit of this confusing approach where we're in favor of the strikes and now we're calling for de-escalation, even though it was all premised on the ground of removing this repressive Iranian regime. So, is it going to be a really tough kind of political balance for this Prime Minister, Bridget, when you're on one hand, you're aligning yourself with the Americans in terms of this idea of removing an Iranian regime, which I don't think anyone is a fan of or anyone is supportive of. But at the same time, and also, the Prime Minister noted immediately, we're not going to get involved militarily. But then what do you do at this point if you guys did the right thing by bombing them, but we're not going to help out with removing this regime? But by the way, we need to use diplomacy to escalate it. It does feel like there's too many balls in the air right now.
Yeah, and I think to my earlier point, it is changing by the hour. And so we are going to have to see how nimble the Prime Minister and his team can be on this, and his ministers and everyone who's going to be following the situation closely and communicating their message and Canada's position on this. I do note that Carney has also referenced the United Nations, and he referenced the G7. And so I think they are going to still be seeking that middle power ground here. But how successfully they could do that, I think time will tell. I also think they're going to be closely watching what some of our other partners do. Politically, Canadians have struggled with their feelings about the United States right now and Canada's relationship with the United States. And so, I do expect the Prime Minister and his team will be looking at, other countries that we have relationships with who will be also taking positions here. So the United Kingdom and France and Germany and some of those places that we've seen Prime Minister Carney visit and spend time in recently. So I think it's going to be quite a test for him to follow up with that Davos speech, as we mentioned, which was so well received both by Canadians here at home and folks around the world. And so will his reputation take a hit? Is he going to be able to carry on what he demonstrated at Davos and that sort of persona? And will he be able to carry that forward amongst this? And I think that's going to be a real test of his leadership and his ability to manage caucus and ministers and to be strong here and to have a position that is Canada's position and not just in lockstep with what the United States is doing. So I am, closely watching how they will react and manage that. It won't be easy.
It does seem like we're in this confusing state right now where it's like, are we trying to sell, the support for the attacks on Iran as a reflection of Davos? Is it a unique situation? And how are we reaching out to allies and how are we trying to build that kind of coalition of middle powers? It seems like right now things are very, very fluid. But one thing I did want to ask, and, I don't want to take too much time, but it seems like when these things happen, the Liberals are always the big question mark. It's how are they going to respond to this? Whereas the NDP obviously is pretty clearly anti-war and would not support any of those efforts. But the Conservatives have always very, very, or at least recently, really kind of clearly landed on the side of backing Israel. I do wonder, though, considering some of the undercurrents you've seen in that party, and even the kind of cleavages you see in the Republican Party down south, where there is that kind of awkward balance of being pro-military, pro-interventionist with this American first idea. Brian, obviously you are the resident conservative whisperer here, but do you think Poilievre might face any risks for being so aggressively pro-interventionist, pro-Israel from a base of his party that might be more supportive of more isolation policies that we've seen the Trump administration at least flirt with before taking this totally different approach?
Well, I think that it is a hard line for Mr. Poilievre to take when he wants to. His advisors certainly are telling him, Canadians, the media is telling him, you need to differentiate yourself from Donald Trump. And he's certainly, going on Mansbridge podcast, taking a Rosemary Barton, taking a far more inclusive approach to his media approach, trying to change his persona a little bit. The speech he just gave last week, changing the tone and tenure. But then every single time Donald Trump does something abroad, you're one of the first ones to support it. And I think that's where Prime Minister Carney's a little bit of the mistake may have came this time. Like anybody that jumps on Donald Trump's foreign policy adventures quickly seems to be a mistake because they're erratic as it is. Their position, Secretary Rubio's position for why they bombed Iran was different than Secretary Hagsa's position, which was different than the president's position yesterday alone. So anybody in Canada that seems to be quick to take a position supporting something that is being done by the United States at this point in time seems to be a bit of a risky play. And certainly it is hard, Marco, as you point out, to be supportive of everything Donald Trump does internationally, but yet try to distance yourself from and tell Canadians I won't be like Donald Trump at home. So it's a difficult position.
Yeah. And Bridget, I'm curious what you think about Pierre, considering Brian brings up a good point. When, of course, there was the arrest of Nicolas Maduro, Pierre was probably the most prominent Canadian voice to not just say, we're supportive of this, but to really kind of, raise his fist in triumph that this was exactly what we need to do. And the federal government took a far more cautious approach. So do you think, not just for Pierre, but Brian brings up a good point with Prime Minister Carney, that regardless of whether you agree with what Trump's doing or not, that there's a lot of risk publicly coming out so quickly after in support of it, considering all the baggage associated with the president, but also, to Brian's point, the fact that there seems to be confusing rationale put forward for why anything happens.
Certainly, listen, I think that the Prime Minister was really trying to show support for the Iranian people who were rising up against an oppressive regime, and I think as well the fact that he was on an international tour and was hoping to announce new trade deals, and the fact that this happened while he was going to be spending a lot of time in front of media, in front of international media. I think it also forced as well the quick response that we saw. And we talked about how quickly he came out with a statement. And I do think some of that relates to just simply the fact that he was going to be asked about it, and he was going to be in front of media very, very soon after, and they needed to take a position. And again, I would just reiterate what comes next is really going to be the defining point of the Prime Minister's position on this. And I think as well for Mr. Poilievre, it's an opportunity for him to potentially draw contrast or differentiate himself from the Prime Minister on this issue, for better or for worse. We won't know. We'll see how Canadians respond. But I think that's something that Poilievre has struggled to do up until this point. And now this issue could be a defining issue for the Prime Minister and the leader of the opposition to draw contrast, and we'll see where Canadians land on that.
No, and that brings us up to our next topic. Of course, the Prime Minister is still on tour, if you want to call it that. He did start the big trip with a deal with India. We heard Saskatchewan kind of cheer on the uranium deal that they've reached. But this, broader sense of cooperation between the two countries is controversial. It's done nothing to kind of quiet the concerns around the issues around foreign interference. It came as reports emerged that, again, it seemed as if, there was more connections with India's representation here in Canada and the Niger killing from 2023. Once again, I think it begs the question of, if we are going to have closer ties with India, what is that going to look like? And we also heard some confusing messaging from the government around whether or not they still consider India to be, a disruptor or someone who is actively practicing foreign interference here. I'll start with you, Brian. What do you make of the fact that we're once again seemingly to, partner up and make a deal with another country, along with China, that has been flagged as a major, foreign interference player in Canadian politics?
Well, I think that we have to be clear-eyed about the approach that we're going to take when we're making deals with other countries. I think the Prime Minister is. I think the criticism he's received is that, some of the briefings that the media has got on this don't seem to line up with the facts of the last several years. But the fact of the matter is, Marco, even though I agree the United States will continue to be our largest trading partner moving forward, it is an unstable trading partner right now that we are too levered by. When number one is pulling away from you, you've got to go to, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, you got to go to China, which is number two. India is number three. By all extents, I think you should take Premier Mo on more trade missions with him. Seems to be his lucky charm. $2.6 billion deal for Cameco and the state of India. At the end of the day, we don't have a choice. We may not love all the trading partners that we have to deal with, but not dealing with them isn't going to stop them from doing the things they're doing. Hopefully, having a better relationship, you can have more control and more levers there. But at the end of the day, We need to expand and grow our trading partners. China, India, Australia. Prime Minister Carney's in now, going to be in Japan. I mean, these are all places where we have to go. The Pacific Rim has 6 of our top 13 trading partners. This is really one of the main things that Prime Minister Carney was elected on, was getting deals and expanding our trade relationships. And rather than leaving it up to his ministers, he seems to be taking it on himself, which is also, I think, a positive step.
Yeah, I don't think anyone's denying that it's been the Saskatchewan winter. They're batting 2 for 0 on foreign trips right now. Bridget, Brian brings up a good point that if we're going to reduce our dependency on the U.S., it's going to go someplace. China and India are the 2 other biggest, economies or emerging economies. How do you balance those 2 things of knowing that it's not just, empty speculation. It's not just, worries of the potential of, quote unquote spy cars. There's documented evidence that both these countries have interfered in our democracy, and not to mention some of these concerns around human rights abuses, especially in China, but not limited there. Obviously, India has its own checkered history. So how do you do that, knowing that I think most Canadians, even if they understand the need to diversify away from the US, might not be terribly, jazzed to jump in bed with India or China?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that was the prime minister's sort of selling point during the election, and he had the creds to back his ability to make these deals. And the reality is, when the United States and Russia are off the table, India and China are the 2 most populous countries. We are a trading nation. We need to look to trade deals, but I think there also has to be, a realization that there are risks that's still need to be considered. I don't think there's a naivety out of the prime minister's office on this. I think they're just being realistic about the geopolitical situation and our need for trade. And so what I think Canadians hope to see is that we can make these deals and open trade while still maintaining the safety and security of Canadians. That's going to require a lot of dialogue. That's going to require a lot of dialogue between the security agencies of these nations, of our Five Eyes nations. I mean, there's going to have to be pieces that come with the trade deal that ensure we can maintain the safety and security of Canadians. But I think, as we said, I think Canadians do realize that this has to be done. I think that the Prime Minister was smart in having a bipartisan approach to this, bringing along Premier Moe and other members of his team. I think it was a smart move. I think that, the fact that the Prime Minister can come back to Canada and tout these deals, and also have someone else returning to his province and to have other conversations, this message being told from other voices, I think is very helpful to the Prime Minister. But as I said, I don't think that there's a naivety about the security challenges out of the Prime Minister's office. I think they just recognize that's something that they're going to have to deal with amidst a trading relationship with these countries.
No, that's a good point. I did want to, briefly just touch upon the Scott Moe aspect here. I think we forget, because so much is overshadowed with Alberta. Obviously, it's a bigger province to the west. But Mark Carney has really negated that kind of criticism from Scott Moe. And it's not like Scott Moe is going out there like Doug Ford and meeting him out on pizza dates or anything along those lines. But, Scott Moe was definitely a thorn in the side of Justin Trudeau. He was someone who basically said his provincial utility company was not going to pay the carbon tax. And now he's out there cheering on the PM, and I don't think there's much risk for Scott Moe, because he's cheering him on because he got a deal on canola and now a deal on uranium. It's not as if, Scott Moe is having to necessarily sacrifice any of his policy positions. I mean, Brian, what do you make of it as, the resident Westerner in our iPolitics? We've seen those polling from Alberta come out that shows it's much more of a competitive race. Mark Carney obviously is from Alberta, even though he's, was born in the Northwest Territories. Is it too early to say that he's successfully kind of contended with at least one of his biggest rivals? And while Danielle Smith is continuing to kind of drum up, a fight with Ottawa, it seems as if he's starting to have a lot of sway in that province. Are we kind of overplaying the threat of Western alienation, considering Mark Carney seems to be kind of popular in that region?
Well, first of all, there's a big difference between Saskatchewan and Alberta. Alberta clearly being the superior of the 2 provinces. But no, the reality is, it does seem like when faced with these issues, Prime Minister Carney is just he's a pragmatist. And he's making the right choices for the country at the time. And every premier, like I have never in my years of politics been around a prime minister that was like, man, I love going to those first minister meetings. The premiers are such great folks. At the end of the day, they're representing their constituents, and the prime minister has to balance what's good for the entire country. And to date, I think Prime Minister Carney has shown that he's willing to do that when it comes to canola. It wasn't just canola. There was other agricultural products in Atlantic Canada and across the West that benefit from this. The agricultural sector is a massive industry in Canada. And at the end of the day, when you do the right thing, that's really all. And we talked about this in the last podcast, Marco. Albertans aren't asking for something specific from Ottawa. They're asking to be left alone by and large and allowed and have their economy and their natural resources to be able to be developed in a safe, secure, mentally friendly way as possible. At the end of the day, that is going to go a long ways to help subside the Western alienation aspect. But this is something that's been built up over 50, 60 years. It's not going to go away with one trade deal or one trip to India or two trips to Asia. But I do think they're good first steps. I think the MOU on the pipeline is a great first step. I think we're moving in the right direction. But no, to answer your question directly, we cannot put too much into the separation sentiment in Western Canada. It would be a death knell for the country to lose the economic part of the economic engine that is feeding us right now. And to be clear, that economic engine has changed over Confederation. At one point in time, the Maritimes were the engine that was feeding everybody. And as the country grows and different resources become discovered, that changes throughout the history of our country. But we have to take very seriously what's happening in Alberta, to a lesser extent, I think Saskatchewan around separation. But at the end of the day, when you talk about foreign interference, I mean, is there another country that has interfered with our elections or the separation of Canada more in the last year than the United States of America? Like, taking meetings and offering loans if you separate it is a pretty big step. So I think the Prime Minister needs to continue to go down that road. I've said it in the past. I think the Leader of the Opposition and the Prime Minister need to work together to assuage the separation fears. And I think anybody that does that and does it pure of heart will be rewarded by Canadians writ large. And it seems, if you believe in the polls, that right now that is Prime Minister Carney.
What do you make of that, Bridget? It seems, Brian makes a good point about this can't be, understated, and this certainly won't be solved. But also, we talk a lot about foreign interference. Brian is right too. Like, I don't think those Alberta separatists are arranging meetings with, the Mahdi government or Xi Jinping. So, how do you kind of balance that relationship, or how do you balance that, if, the contending with, that Western alienation, while at the same time kind of acknowledging that it seems like our closest and our dearest allies to the South may seem to be stoking that sentiment, at least right now.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with Brian, and that the Prime Minister is making all the right moves and he's taking the right steps, and we're moving in the right direction. My fear is, if we have enough time, if we're looking at a referendum in the fall, does he have enough of a runway to repair that relationship? Particularly if there's the threats of foreign interference that we've been hearing of outside interested parties stoking those flames. And I think that's the biggest concern. I think if there was a longer runway, I would feel much more confident in the ability to sort of bring the West back on side in a better way. I think the Prime Minister is smart in adding an additional messenger in Premier Moe. I always think back to I think it was the Maclean's cover of the Great Resistance with all of sort of the Western premiers. And, so I think that we've made a lot of progress, but can we get there in time, and especially up against some of these outside influences? I think the next few months are going to be very telling. I think, what can we see accomplished in terms of moving towards a pipeline? What can we see out of the Major Projects Office? They're going to have to move very quickly to point to real things, and not just to say that we're moving in the right direction. But I think the Prime Minister recognizes that. I think that's going to make up a big part of his focus. And, Brian joked about the First Minister's meetings and looking forward to those. But the Prime Minister did commit to meeting monthly with the premiers, which I think is a significant step. And I think that's part of his trying to build relationships with the premiers and bring everyone on side and take that Team Canada approach, which is what Canadians want. I think that's what we saw in the last federal election, was this desire from Canadians for a Team Canada approach and to bring people together. And so can we get Alberta on side with that? Let's see.
I mean, this reminded me of that Maclean's issue. Wasn't Doug Ford on that? And now he's like now he's like the Team Carney
He was, yeah. Yeah, we've come a long way. It's lots of...
No politicians like that, Lord Ryan. I don't.
But Marco, you mentioned a couple of their, like with the Scott Mopar, you mentioned the carbon tax. Like, what carbon tax?
Yeah, fair.
Mm-hmm.
These are things like the biggest gripes that these guys had. Prime Minister Carney has by and large come in and said, we're a new government. There's been a lot of bad economic decisions made over the past several years, and we're going to right those. So.
It's true. It's
and,
like what...
and look, Premier Ford's a little more sensitive, so he requires a pizza date every once in a while. Nothing wrong with that.
No comment on that. But one thing I did want to say, keeping with the trip, I was hoping we'd have a bit more kind of meat on the bones there in terms of the Prime Minister kind of weighing in. But one thing that's become kind of a sleeper, big talking point of this trip has been the fact that the Prime Minister has not talked to the media the whole time. Was thinking he was going to do so today, but the latest messaging we've heard is that he's touched out in Sydney, and he probably won't do that at least today. That probably goes that. I mean, we're stretching into almost a week where the PM hasn't spoken. I don't think he's given a full press conference to reporters during his trip. I'll start with you, Bridget. Is this concerning, troubling? What do you make of the fact that obviously we're having this big regional war or potential regional war breakout, and the PM hasn't really spoken to reporters? Is that a problem?
I mean, the press gallery is traveling with the Prime Minister. So there is, I would say a level of transparency that is still there. I think it would be far more concerning if media weren't allowed to participate and weren't allowed to, take part in that trip. I suspect that this really is about having a one clean, focused message to conclude the trip. I do expect that we will hear the Prime Minister speak to media soon. I think clearly they were really trying to control the narrative around this trip, keep it very focused on the deals that are being made. That's what they see as the winning piece here for the Prime Minister, and potentially going into some elections soon. So I do think that we're seeing a bit of a tightening up of the narrative and a really sort of controlled environment around that, and them probably wanting to see the trip come to conclusion before they're so they are able to get out a sort of consolidated message. And then of course the questions are probably going to entirely focus around the situation in the Middle East now. And they probably recognize that. And given how quickly things are changing, I think they recognize that they are going to lose the message around trade should he speak to the media, because that's what the questions will be focused on. And so I think they're trying to sort of complete the trip, announce things via press release and have those picked up. And like I said, be very controlled about it. But ultimately, I mean, I think that you can't avoid what's going on in the world, and he will have to address it and speak to the media about it soon.
Yeah. And Brian, what do you make of that? I've seen people in conservative circles, kind of imply that if Prime Minister Stephen Harper was doing this, it would be a total meltdown. Media would be freaking out. Although I've seen a lot of complaints from my colleagues in the press gallery. What do you make of the fact that he's kind of hasn't spoken to the media in basically a week?
Well, I agree with Bridget. I think any good comms team is going to try to keep their narrative very focused on this around trade. And unfortunately for the Prime Minister, global circumstances aren't going to allow that to happen. I think by taking a little of the oxygen out of the room and putting an and out there, putting McGuinty out there, they're trying to be responsible enough to give media access to Canadians, to the ministry. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with Prime Minister Carney. He's been very clear that he's the one in charge. He's the CEO. So he's going to have to speak to this at some point in time. And I also think, as we started out with this, taking such a crystal clear principled position right off the bat in his mind is probably going to come back to have to answer some pretty tough questions when there isn't there doesn't seem to be a clear, concise narrative of to why in the middle of negotiations that both sides seem to have we're saying we're going well. The United States and Israel decided to attack by air Iran. So, the Prime Minister's not probably excited to get out there and destroy the message that he's been creating over the last week of negotiations and deals. So I think that's probably what's going on here. But at some point in time, he's going to have to answer the question.
Mm-hmm. That's totally fair. I will say though that the Prime Minister, I think many people would disagree with me that he's been a bit more camera shy or media shy than his predecessor Justin Trudeau. But eventually you're gonna have to start answering those questions. I did want to shift gears to something that now seems maybe a bit trivial compared to what's happening in the world. But last time we were on the air, if you want to call it that, election speculation kind of dominated our show. The polls keep showing what they've been showing for the past month. The Davos speech gave the PM a big boost in the polls. If there was an election tomorrow, it would signify a big Liberal majority. But once again, you see how quickly things can be totally upended for everything happening in the world, and Donald Trump continuing to be such a disruptive figure. I guess I'll ask point blank, Bridget, do you think we're heading to an election either this spring or in the fall, considering the fact that the polls keep showing that the Liberals have a big advantage and would likely win a majority if an election was held tomorrow?
So I think the nominations speculation, I think we can kind of put aside. This is very normal in a minority government situation. This is just the responsible thing to do, for all parties, frankly, is to always be ready for an election. Minority governments don't traditionally last very long. We've had a few, but I think that's just something that's parties do and should be doing. Obviously, we have the big question of by-elections, which could push the Prime Minister into a majority territory with a single seat in Terrebonne and other sort of safe Liberal seats. I don't think the Prime Minister wants an election. I think he wants a majority. I don't know that he wants an election. He's not a campaigner in the traditional sense. He obviously hasn't come from a world of politics the way that I think we saw. Trudeau loved to campaign. He was a good campaigner. He liked being out on the road in full energy. I don't think that's what Carney is looking for, but I do think he wants a majority. So do they continue to try to do that through the by-elections that are upcoming, through convincing members of other parties to cross the floor and join theirs? I think they are getting to a point, though, where they're going to have to make that decision. And yes, I think if an election were held tomorrow, that we would see a Liberal majority. The situation in the Middle East, however, and how Prime Minister and Canada responds to Iran and the attacks, I just think that's going to be those are the types of things that can change the outcome and the direction of an election. Those are things that change people's voting intentions. And so I think that they will need to feel very confident that they have a solid and strong position, that they still have the support of Canadians in terms of what Canada's role is going to be. And they're probably going to want to sit back and see where things go over the next few weeks before making that decision. Because what the risk would be if they call an election too quickly and things escalate in the Middle East and the Prime Minister doesn't have the support of Canadians in the position that he's taking, it could go the other way. So I think that a lot has changed even in the last week. I think potentially a week ago, they might have seriously been considering an election, and now the stakes have just changed pretty significantly. And so I think that the Prime Minister would like his majority, probably looking at how he might be able to do that through a successful by-election in Terrebonne and moving forward. I think they're going to be watching how the next couple of weeks and months play out.
Yeah, no, I wanted to actually bring up the last time the Liberals went early. I know, I guess in 2025 they did, but at the time, the opposition parties were saying that they were going to bring down the government. But in 2021, the two big criticisms were obviously now is not the right time for an election. We're in the middle of a pandemic. And the second thing was you haven't made an argument about the need for an election. And then, of course, we saw the first couple of days of that election campaign totally dominated by the fall of Kabul. Bridget, on that point, do you think the government, if they did want to go early, when do we need to see them start putting that foundation together? Because again, maybe I could be wrong, but it does seem like if you're going to make the argument that we got to go and have an early snap election, you kind of have to lay that foundation to explain to Canadians why we can't just do what we're doing. Because it seems like the Conservatives have, put up their hands and said, we're not going to stand in your way on some of these big things. They helped pass the budget bill, for crying out loud. Like, do you need to do that? And if so, how early do you need to start to explain to Canadians why an election right now is needed?
I think oftentimes that happens on the campaign trail as well. I think the foundation that has been set or that, they would probably point to is the upcoming negotiation of CUSMA. I think there's an argument that they could make where, they really need a strong majority in order to do that Canadians want a deal, that the Prime Minister is the right person to do this. I think Carney could position him very well in that space. And so I think it depends on how many external factors we're looking at outside of the Canada-US relationship, which remains top of mind for Canadians, would be a top election issue. And so I think that would be the foundation for which Carney would likely point to in a general election. But again, can he avoid some of these major external factors that are very much out of his control? But again, I think some of that foundation has already been laid, and I think he's been laying it over the course of the past year. But oftentimes we see it justified on the campaign trail as well.
No, I think that's a great point. That's Doug Ford last year had a commanding majority in the House. Basically, a mandate to deal with the quote unquote coming storm. It looks like, Carney could make that argument with CUSMA starting up. Brian, you've been on the other side of these, snap election calls in a minority context. How important is it to make a case in advance? Or is it something that you just kind of make on the campaign trail and trust that, the ballot box question doesn't really get altered on how voters perceive, your reason to vote?
I think it's something that we in the media like to speculate on as something that is speculatable, but at most it'll affect the first 3-4 days of questioning from the media until you get into we're in an election. What are the topics and issues that are important to Canadians regionally and nationally? And so I've yet to see it really be a major issue. I go back to I was in the Alberta legislature in the Klein days. They had a commanding majority. They were the first ones to put a law in place that you had to have, fixed election dates, and they were the first ones to break it. So it doesn't really seem to come back to bite anybody. Certainly Prime Minister Harper went early in I think it was 2008, during the 2008 crisis. We went early. Prime Minister Trudeau's gone early. It just doesn't seem to be the narrative builder that we like to make it out to be in the beginning. And as you said, Doug Ford being the latest of those. I really think that I said earlier, I've said all along, I think the Liberals are going to try to build out a window in the spring in which they can go to an election. It is only responsible as any government would want to do. And they're certainly doing that. I think the the bombing in Iran at this point in time in the war that is breaking out in the Gulf states is risky, not in that the position the Prime Minister took. And I think part of the reason he probably took it was you knew where Pierre Poilievre was going to go on this, so there really is no space between the two of them. So politically, I don't think there's a lot of risk there. I think the risk is in the instability of the U.S. position, and it does seem like the U.S. position, according to Secretary Rubio, is being driven by what Israel wants to do. So if that's the case, is there going to be ground troops deployed during this? Certainly that would prolong a conflict if there was a ground invasion to accompany the air war, which would then create, I think, real problems back at home here in Canada when it comes to inflation, cost of goods, you name it. We're going to be impacted by that. And that may not be a spot where a government wants to go into an election where, you have no control and no idea of really what's going on economically at home because of factors that are being driven by a war that you're not involved in. So I could see that being something that they might want to pause for. I would also say, Mark, when I said this, Prime Minister Carney seems to me to be a pragmatist. I hear my Liberal friends in Ottawa, and I do have a few of them, Marco, always saying, man, this guy, he's one of you. And all the Conservatives say, oh, he's a Liberal. But he seems to be a pragmatist, and he seems to feel like he's the right person at the right time to lead the country through a really tough geopolitical era for Canada. And if that's the case and the opposition is no longer impeding you, and you go through these by-elections and you get to, close or to a majority government, there's really no impetus for it. And he may just decide that even though the numbers are good, he doesn't want an election. And I harken back to my days with Prime Minister Harper. Oftentimes, we would be at very good spots in the polls where it would look like you're going to get a majority government, but you use that political capital that you built up to push through more things that you want to push through because it's not the right time for the country to have an election. And that's what I hope Prime Minister Carney does. But certainly, as any responsible politician, he's going to build a window in the spring in which they can go. He's going to try to build a window in the fall in which they can go, because as Bridget said, minority parliaments in this country traditionally last 15, 16 months.
What do you think about Bridget? I think she made a really good point about the Prime Minister not necessarily seeming to want to run an election. I don't know if there's any politician who's very keen to, but I think the distinction has been made that, he doesn't seem to be that type of politician, definitely not a Doug Ford type who seems to, or a Justin Trudeau type that seems to get motivation, get energy from being on the campaign trail. Just to be as blunt about it, like, is this someone who, considering his background, like it would be it'd be kind of like the, option of last resort for this guy? Like, it doesn't seem like he likes being the kind of glad-handing politician on the campaign trail. Like, does that influence, you think, his decision-making, Brian?
I have no idea. At the end of the day, I would agree with you that Mark Carney seems to not thrive on the campaign trail. And certainly it is a place where Pierre is very strong. And we don't know who the next leader of the NDP is going to be. But Prime Minister Carney seems to enjoy being Prime Minister and governing. And in fact, his strong stays on the campaign trail were when he had called an emergency cabinet meeting to present himself as Prime Minister. So, he may be, and not unlike Prime Minister Harper, who was no tornado on the campaign trail either. At the end of the day, sometimes you're strongest when you are governing, and that's what's going to bring them to the best possible place for the next election, whenever it is.
That's a good point. I know the topics we have for today, so I'll move on to last thoughts. Bridget, I'll start with you. Is there something, in the past week that maybe you think got, was underreported, or something you're looking for into the next week that you would like to flag?
Yeah, I think one thing that got a fair bit of discussion was Poilievre's speech at the Economic Club, I believe it was, where he took we saw a different version of him, I think, than we have seen in previous iterations. I think we saw much different language around the US and around Donald Trump. And so there was a clear effort there to reposition himself on that issue. And so that's certainly something that caught my eye. Where I think that, he is struggling and will continue to struggle is getting caucus on board and aligned with that. I mean, he had a member of his own party, his own caucus in Washington, trying to do side deals and have lunch with JD Vance, and so it's one thing when you're saying as the leader that you're going to have this tough position on Trump in the US, but if your own caucus isn't buying in on that, it's really difficult to sell that to Canadians. And so I think that's going to be something that he is going to have to figure out from a caucus management perspective, from how he's going to communicate that to some of his base that might support Trump, but to sell to that, the broader interests of Canadians who want that kind of messaging on the US. So I am going to be watching how he continues to navigate that, how he tries to sort of rebrand his position on that, while at the same time needing to have his caucus on side for it to have any real legitimacy with Canadians.
That's a good point. We'll see if he tries to affix a muzzle to Jamel Giovanni. But Ryan, what about you? Final thoughts?
Well, listen, I'm very interested in when the Prime Minister Carney finally does decide to address media, domestic media again, his position, and if it's going to be a changing position, or his thoughts on the American-Israeli bombardment of Iran. There was a lot in that Davos speech that drew such kudos from around the world about middle powers needing to no longer put the sign up for the United States and allow them to avoid the international rules-based system. I think this can be an opportunity for Prime Minister Carney to live up to his speech or go in a different direction. Either way, I think it's going to be really interesting to hear what his position on that is. And he certainly had a week to think about it. So I think that's going to be an interesting thing that I'm watching for next week, Mark.
Yeah, no, definitely something to keep our eyes peeled on. I mean, my last thoughts really, I think, are in BC. On Friday, there was a news release put out about an agreement that the feds reached with Musqueam First Nations around recognizing Aboriginal title in large parts of Metro Vancouver. I don't know if it was in any part of the country, it would have attracted the kind of media scrutiny that it has. There's a lot of debate in that part of Canada around the kind of limits or reach of Indigenous title, specifically whether that interferes with private property rights. It seems to be a big can of worms for the BC NDP government. It definitely seems to be something that the BC Conservative Party want to jump on, considering the fact that I think one of the top candidates for the job has made it kind of the centerpiece to their leadership bid. So very curious to see how that shakes up and how that becomes an issue in that province. Let's be blunt here. People are worried that, they're going to lose their homes because of the Cowichan decision. Is that going to happen? The further uncertainty that creates, and I'm very curious to see if that, upends anything on the federal level. There are limits to what we can do. I mean, treaty rights are embedded in the Constitution, and certainly the provincial government might not have all the levers there. But the fact that this agreement that I think might turn out to be fairly innocuous in terms of any impact on private property rights is driving this media narrative, I think speaks to the level of uncertainty in that province. So very curious to see how that impacts the BC Conservative leadership race, the BC provincial election, but will it impact what the federal parties do? So very curious to see how that shakes out, and something I'll be keeping my eyes on. That brings us to the end of today's show. Brian, thanks as always for co-piling with me, and Bridget, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
We'll be here the same time next week. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Marco.
Thank you.